am Will Fenton, the Director of Scholarly Innovation at the Library Company of Philadelphia. It's my pleasure to host this new webinar program that we do called Fireside Chats, harkening back to the sort of FDR Depression era weekly series, appropriate given the subject matter of tonight's talk, the 1780s Depression, a depression that I think gets a short shrift. A couple of quick words. First of all, for those of you who are new to the library company, we are Benjamin Franklin's library. We were founded in 1731, the first subscription library. Of course, we've changed a lot over the past 290 years. And now we are a research library supporting all sorts of fantastic scholars who come in and do fantastic work towards articles and books that reshape fields. This whole series couldn't be possible without that fellowship program. It is fellows that have volunteered with alacrity and generosity to support this series. And so I'm grateful that we can do this over the summer and sort of keep the connection alive while we're all scattered and siloed. So a couple of quick words about the structure of this. Basically, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. He's going to have 35, 40 minutes to talk about a project he's been working on for some time. And then we're going to open up for questions. How do you submit a question? Well, that's a great question, all right? If you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a little Q&A button. There are no points against you to submitting your questions early. So if you're hearing something that's sparking curiosity, interest, a contribution of any kind, I encourage you to use the Q&A button throughout the talk, and I will do my best to work through those sequentially once we get to the Q&A session. There's also a chat feature, which I will be using if I come up with anything clever to share with all of you. Those include links to digital resources in our collections or scholarly publications that might be interesting to anyone who's tuning in. Now, of course, there's a lot I don't know about this subject matter, and that's where our follow-up matters a lot. So all of you have registered for this event, which means that we will be following up sometime in the middle of next week with not only a link to the static version of this, we'll put this whole talk up on YouTube, which you can share with your friends and colleagues, but I'll also be sharing additional resources that you can use to continue learning if this is something that you're excited about. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't invite you to sign up for our email list. If you're excited about this event and you're interested in other things we're doing, the best way to find out is with our email list, which you can access at the bottom of the homepage, librarycompany.org. All right, I think I hit all my major points there. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott C. Miller, who is the International Center for Finance Postdoctoral Fellow in Economic and Business History at the Yale School of Management. He earned his PhD from the University of Virginia in 2018, specializing in the transformation of the American economy after independence from Great Britain. His work explores the effect of economic, political, and social turmoil on commercial networks, domestic markets, trade systems, and business practices in the post-revolutionary United States and early 19th century Europe. Dr. Miller was notably a Library Company Pease Research Fellow in 2017. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Will. Let me get this screen share up and going. All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. I think this may sound a little cliche, so to speak, but the Library Company really is a vital institution in this country. I spent months and months of my young life and career there instead of being home with my wife and dog. And so they were always really, really good to me. And so it's an honor to kind of be speaking under their banner, so to speak, tonight. And I hope you enjoy it. So what I want to talk to you about tonight is what I believe is the most consequential event in American history. And if it's not the most consequential event, it's most likely the most consequential event that Americans largely know nothing about. And I think it's especially prescient at this moment in time, kind of in the middle of the crisis that we now find ourselves. We're obviously having this conversation over Zoom as opposed to in person. that is particularly relevant, I would say. And as you can see here on the screen, and as Will said, I now do history at a business school, but I got my PhD from a history department. And whereas history departments tend to encourage you to stay in the past or to learn the past for the past's sake, it's quite a different mentality at a business school. And so at a business school, history is largely seen as prologue to the present. And it's an opportunity to not just talk about what happened in the past, but use it to get a better understanding of our present and our future. And as I'm sure all of you know, we are enduring a interesting present and unstable future, to say the least. And I wanted to talk about this particular topic tonight because whether we like it or not, humans reach for the past to try to get an understanding of their present in times of crisis. That's just kind of what we do. And as I've been doing a lot of talks and discussions about the current crisis over the last couple of months, that analogy, that reach to the past that you tend to hear most is to the Great Depression. I would say that there are certainly some things to that. You often hear, you know, we haven't had unemployment levels like this since the Great Depression. While some of that is true, I want to present to you tonight the idea that the best analogy is not necessarily the Great Depression, but rather the Depression of the 1780s. Not just because I work on the early Republic and this is what was happening then, but for reasons I want to bring out over the course of this talk. I think it's the best kind of example of what we're dealing with right now. And I want to underscore that as you can see from this scary graph, this depression was devastating. Its course, as you can see, looks very similar to the Great Depression in how it transpired. To the point that Peter Linder and Jeffrey Williamson, two of the greatest economic historians around today, said that the Revolutionary War and Confederation-era turmoil, which is the depression that we're talking about, may have been America's greatest income per person slump ever in percentage terms, and was inflicted on a much poorer population than the Americans who suffered the Great Depression of the 1930s. The fact that the public largely doesn't know about this and that historians, in all honesty, have largely missed it, to me is largely inexcusable, especially because the founders knew that this was an important event and that it would most likely shape the entire course of the United States moving forward. Alexander Hamilton, who you can see over my shoulder here, said on the cusp of independence in a letter to the governor of Rhode Island, "We in all probability hasten to a dangerous crisis from which it may be much difficult to emerge." And if this is true, which hopefully I will convince you that it is, this depression was if not the central context for the founding era. And so what I want to do tonight is reintroduce you, or perhaps introduce you for the first time to this depression of the 1780s. And I want to do so in kind of a broad sweep, but I want to do so for two reasons in particular. The first is the history department answer, right? It is our history, and it is the central context for the foundation of the United States as we know it in its earliest and most formative years. And then the second is the business school answer, right? The best analogy for the present, I believe, is this one. And so as we move along through the night, what I want to do is kind of outline this depression for you, introduce it to you, while at certain moments kind of taking a little intermission to connect it to some of the events that we're enduring now. While also giving you a hint in some of the research, the more in-depth research I'm doing. Actually, I was doing it all day today and all the last several months to try to understand this crisis much better, because it is widely unknown in the scholarly as well as the public. And then what we're going to do is have a Q&A. I am going to fly through some of this material, and I do apologize for that. But if you do have questions either about this crisis or the current one, feel free to send them in, and we'll address those in the Q&A. But the underlying premise that I want to kind of fill out for you, or kind of lay down first thing, is this idea that is kind of the core to my entire historical philosophy, and that is economic crises profoundly shape the societies in which they originate. We need to realize that, ex ante, that we will not have a say in this. History tells us that our society will look very, very different if our crisis today even comes close to resembling those that come before it. And what I also want to outline is that while our society certainly will change, we do have some degree of agency in the direction that change takes us. And that if we can kind of get a sense of what happened in the past, hopefully we won't make the same mistakes and we'll improve upon what they did. So, where do we start? Well, we need to start by understanding that something truly disastrous did happen to the American economy between 1775 and 1790. This was everything from currency and in credit crises to widespread bankruptcies and defaults. On the societal side, civic unrest became ubiquitous in every state. Economic warfare broke out between the American states themselves, and you saw an altogether decomposition of the American social, economic, and political fabric, if one did indeed exist at all. And so, kind of in contrast to the countervailing narrative that is kind of pervasive in the public and even in the academic literature, is I'm taking this quote from a friend of mine who wrote it. I wish I had written it, but I'm going to steal it. Rather than striding forth among nations, the United States limped into independence under the weight of economic disaster. And so what I want to do before we really get into the meat of this talk is ask you to take a second and kind of check your priors on this subject if you have them at all. My guess is that you do and you just don't know it. But what I mean by that is it's very difficult for us to put aside our knowledge that the United States has become the global economic superpower. And so what we tend to do, whether intentionally or not, is kind of take that, project it back on the past and say, okay, there may have been some problems here, but the United States became independent and kind of went on a glide path toward becoming a superpower. And this was undoubtedly not the case, and quite the opposite. While there are some difficulties with this type of analogy, the United States at this period was much more like a developing nation in the common parlance than a developed one. It was a colonial economy that was resource rich and designed to extract things from the ground and send it to a metropole across an ocean. And so in this way, it was susceptible and vulnerable to kind of geo-financial and geo-economic factors that the United States today may not be. So I want you to kind of keep that in your mind as we move through the rest of the talk. All right. So the first thing we need to understand about this crisis is that it was indeed a national crisis. And this is quite rare as far as crises in American history go. What tends to be the case, because of just the vast nature of the American geography, is there is a crisis in one place, and then it migrates to another, migrates and migrates and migrates. It's very rare that one place or the entire nation are experiencing a crisis at the same time, but that's exactly what happened here for a couple of main reasons. The first is that the British Navy blockaded the entire eastern seaboard, and the British Army occupied large swaths of the entire nation to be. And as a result, and this will sound very familiar to you, virtually all non-essential trade and internal commerce was stopped. Really, the only thing that happened was the provisioning of the military, and very, very small scale local commerce happened. And then to make this all worse, and something that will sound much more familiar to us, is there was a large scale smallpox epidemic that impacted not just Americans from Georgia to what is now Maine, but all the way into the continent as well, ending up affecting major parts of what we now call California. And so if you look at this national crisis kind of moving out of the revolution, it impacted the nation even before it even acted like a nation itself. So if we look at the revolution and the major problems to the revolution, there are two main factors, and I want to address them both. The first is the revolution resulted in widespread and extensive capital loss. What I mean by that is, beginning with the first kind of element, is the United States experienced significant degradement to its physical capital stock. And physical capital is just the tangible modes of production. So that can be a field for a farmer, a building, a tool, a machine, whatever. And the war brought a serious degradation on this particular capital stock. Of course, the way to replenish physical capital is to deploy financial capital. The problem with this is that the colonies had always been almost completely reliant on Britain for its financial capital, and the little capital that it did have was largely housed with an upper class that turned out to be loyalists and left as a result of the revolution. So coming out of the Revolutionary War itself, the country was almost completely devoid of any type of financial capital. And then thirdly, and probably most important, the human capital stock experienced a dramatic loss as well. A lot of Americans don't know this, but the Revolutionary War was actually the most deadly conflict in American history besides the Civil War. And in this conflict that we're talking about, over 1% of the entire American populace died. This would be the equivalent today if over a 7-year war, so take the war in Iraq, instead of about 5,000 people dying, 3.5 million died. Like we can't even conceptualize that. But then on top of that, between 5 and 10 times that number were debilitated as a result of the conflict and thus could not work productively afterwards. So what you have in placing this all together is a significant degradement of the American capital stock moving into independence. The other main issue, which I'll focus on from here on out, is the monetary issue. If you know anything about the economic element of the revolution, you tend to know about the inflation crisis, and you see this here in this scary graph. There were several reasons for this inflation crisis. Although it did not reach the level of hyperinflation as we would consider it today, it was a very large problem. And there were two main causes for this. The first is the excess printing of continental dollars that weren't backed by anything, whether that be land or gold or silver, or they were not redeemable for taxes. So that currency very quickly lost its value. And the second was the increasing bidding war for already scarce resources from not just Americans, but from the British and the French that came over, were trying to provision their armies, and were bidding for goods from the United States as well. But what I want to focus on tonight, and this is where I'm going to start to dig in just a little bit into the in-depth research that I'm doing. It's going to have a few graphs. I do apologize, but I'll do my best to kind of describe them and elaborate. Is that if you talk to crisis fighters, and I've been lucky enough to meet some of the best in the world over the past 6 months or so, the thing that strikes fear into crisis fighters in government and in industry is not necessarily inflation, it is deflation. The consistent falling of prices is a big problem. And it's not something that we kind of really get. It seems a bit counterintuitive, right? You know, hey, prices are falling, this means goods are cheaper. You know, why is this necessarily a bad thing? Well, my goal tonight is to convince you that it is bad, and this is what turns like a significant downturn into a broad-based depression. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that it creates an adverse psychology. And what I mean by that is if prices are falling for several months in a row, let's say you need to buy something. You see that prices have been falling for a while, but then you say, maybe I'll put off that purchase till next month because the price might go down. And then next month it goes down more, and you say, maybe the next month it'll go down. You see this kind of spiral that we can get into, wherein then just the normal commerce of a society is kind of pushed down the line. But more important than this bad psychology, there is something that I like to call the debt deflation cycle, which I'm going to go to in a lot more depth in just a minute. But before I do, I want to explain kind of how deflation arises in an economy and why it did in the Revolution era. So there are three main causes of deflation in an economy. I bet most of you didn't think that you were signing up for Econ 101 in here, but you turned in, so yes, you are. There are much more than this, but I'm consolidating it into three. The first is large increases in supply. The second is large increases or large contractions in demand. This kind of makes a little bit of sense according to kind of the Econ 101 that I'm sure all of you had. But most importantly, especially in a crisis situation, the biggest factor of deflation is the contraction of the money supply. And this is a bit more abstract, but I'm going to lay out just a tiny bit of conception and then show you exactly how this manifests. So don't worry about that. But a contraction of the money supply, in effect, makes the daily transaction of goods much, much more difficult, and then just slows the overall pace of the economy. So what spurred the deflation during the revolution? Well, there was kind of a triad of domestic causes, which the vast majority of the literature, which admittedly is quite small, has focused on. These three factors are: one, the elimination of the continental dollar in 1781. The continental dollar had essentially inflated away all of its value, and so Congress essentially wanted nothing to do with it and essentially just stopped redeeming it, cast it to the wayside. It's a simplistic explanation, but we'll go with that for now. The second was the cessation of gold inflows from France and Britain, right? If they're buying goods here in the United States, they're shipping gold and bills of credit over from Europe. When the war ends, that ends and the money supply contracts. And then third is let's see, to be generous, the small and lackluster nature of the American financial system that was simply not able to push back on some of these larger countervailing forces. But while the literature is largely looked in and ascribed the depression to these domestic factors, the work I'm doing right now essentially argues that, just like the Great Depression, we need to look outside of the United States to understand why the United States got as bad as it did. And what happened in this particular case is the United States fell victim to British policy, which in turn caused a massive contraction of the American money supply, and thus a deflation cycle that went on for years and years and years. So again, go back to that framework I mentioned at the beginning. The United States is not a future economic superpower at this point. It is a developing economy at best, without the financial institutions able to push back against the policy apparatus of larger economic and financial powers. So what happened here is, throughout the war, and even a little bit before that, the British money supply itself had been contracting pretty significantly. And most importantly, as you see in the blue line, the gold supply had been falling quite dramatically, to the point where it almost disappeared. And this really unnerved British policymakers. So in 1784 and in 1785, the Bank of England and the British Treasury enacted a series of policies identified in these vertical dotted lines to kind of bring gold and money back to Britain, and thus boost the British money supply. And as you can see, if you look at where these lines are and you can see what happened afterward, they actually did a fantastic job. The problem was, as I mentioned, the United States did not have the institutions or resources to push back against these factors, and they were in fact unable to stop these effects on their own shores, even if the British didn't necessarily mean to impact the American economy the way it did. Another scary graph. I'll just describe it very quickly. So what did these policies look like by the British government? I just want you to focus in on this area right in here, if you can. There were three main things that the British government did. The first is they raised short-term and medium-term interest rates. And what that meant is they were essentially enticing British money to come back into the British economy with the promise of higher rewards on the capital they invested. You see this all the time in modern day. And what this essentially does is it makes investment more attractive where you have higher interest rates, because the risk is much higher if you invest outside of kind of the global economic hegemon. But investors are willing to do it in order to get higher returns. But if you have an increase in interest rates, that makes the risk-adjusted return much more appealing and results in money flowing back into the kind of the economic and financial center. The second main effect, or the main policy, was British policymakers essentially making the Bank of England and lots of other high-powered British banks stop discounting or redeeming bills of credit from American merchants. And what this did is it didn't just cut off credit to American merchants by way of British merchants, is it resulted in essentially the entire cutting off of what they called book credit, which are both assets and liabilities in terms of a credit apparatus, but it also contributes a significant portion to the money supply. And so book credit goes away, the money supply contracts, just like we were talking about earlier. And so one final policy is Parliament actually outlawed the exportation of gold outside of the empire, which also you have gold coming back into Britain and no gold going back across the ocean toward the American Republic at this time. And so what this essentially did is it created a gigantic vacuum in Britain that sucked gold and broader monetary elements back, resulting in a contraction of the money supply in the United States and falling prices thereafter. I don't have time to go into this awesome chart that I have up here on the screen because of time, but essentially this is me showing my work. And if anybody is truly interested, I will happily explain this to you. But for now, you're gonna have to take my word for it that this is what was going on. So I've given you the argument that there was a monetary contraction and resulting deflation in the United States. So the question remains, how did that infect the broader economy? What did that look like in tangible terms? Well, it really inaugurated what I am using broadly to call a debt deflation cycle. There is a much more technical definition for this term, but I'm using it more broadly to outline this cascading cycle of increasing bankruptcies, falling investment, and increasing unemployment that come as a result of significant deflation. So bankruptcies, what's going on here? Well, the mechanism here is fairly simple to grasp. Let's take, for example, that you're doing this, the same amount of business, which is a stretch in this type of situation, but let's just assume for the moment you're doing the same amount of business as a business owner, but your prices are going down. And so even though you're selling the same amount of stuff, your revenue or broader income is continually ticking downward. Well, the problem is the debts that you've contracted in advance of this deflation spiral, they don't go down when your revenue goes down, right? If you're losing money in your business, you still have to pay the mortgage on the property. You don't suddenly see that start to tick down when your prices go down. And so what happens in the parlance of the trade is that as your revenues go down and your debts stay the same, your real debts actually get much bigger. And why businesses can deal with this for a short period of time, if this cycle kind of continues at all, you start to see businesses default on their debts, which I was reading an article in the New York Times right before I got on this call, and we're starting to see bits and pieces of that. Can go into that later if you want. Nonetheless, you start to see, if this extends over any period of time, a rash of bankruptcies. And this was ubiquitous in the 1780s United States. George Van Cleve, who's a friend of mine and an excellent historian on this period, did research on this. And he found that in just one county in Massachusetts, in just 1 year, there were nearly 3,000 debt cases, which was over 2.5 times increase over a similar period just before the Revolution. And this, like I said, this was not just a case in Massachusetts, this was everywhere. The historian Bruce Mann from Harvard, who I just found out, believe it or not, is Elizabeth Warren's husband. Interesting. But he wrote a fantastic book called Republic of Debtors, in which he essentially made the case that you could not get away from these bankruptcies, as they were everywhere. And I'm sure you can understand the broader economic implications of this. So the second thing that tends to impact the broader economy as a result of deflation is falling investment. The mechanism here is quite similar. So let's assume that prices are going down, thus your revenues are going down as well. And well, let's just assume for the sake of this that interest rates are staying the same. This is actually not likely. Interest rates are likely to go up. But if you just take this model at face value, your revenues are going down, the interest rates that you would have to pay for a loan or any other kind of credit are staying the same. And so that gap is increasingly opening, making the real cost of credit that you would have to pay much, much higher. And as a result, investors tend to either put off investment altogether or lessen it in order to save on their costs. And as a result, you get falling or in many cases cratering investment across the economy just at the minute that you need it the most. I could give you, I was picking out examples of this. I could give you 100 different examples, but I'm going to focus on this gentleman, Thomas Evans, from the incredibly morbidly named Murder Kill Mill on the border of Pennsylvania and Baltimore. And he wrote to his friend Levi Hollingsworth in Philadelphia. He said, "I am about rebuilding this mill, which was actually damaged in the war, but money is so scarce here that I can't get a shilling for anything I sell, so I can't possibly carry on the building or the rebuilding." Again, this is just one of many examples that kind of infiltrated the American economy during the 1780s. And then finally, the one that is probably most deleterious and the one that we would most recognize right now is significantly increasing unemployment. Again, the mechanism is quite similar. You have your revenues going down and wages, or what we call in the biz, tend to be sticky. If wages tend not to move, but if they are negotiated downward, that tends to take time, and they certainly don't go as fast as prices are falling. So as a result of that, you have the gap between your revenue and your labor cost increasingly going. So as your real labor costs go up, you see declining employment in terms of diminishing hours, furloughs, if we use the modern parlance, or absolute layoffs, so of which we're seeing a lot right now. And again, this was a fundamental element of this period during the early republic. It's very difficult to actually nail down numbers, but we would have seen unemployment rates quite similar to what we're actually experiencing right now. And I want to take a moment to pause to say that this deflation cycle didn't just hurt workers that were wage or contract workers. They also really hurt the millions upon millions of enslaved workers that were a prominent fixture and really kind of made up a significant part of the American labor force. This letter that I found from William Nemo, who was a merchant in Richmond, wrote to a friend in Philadelphia saying, "Tobacco having fallen in price, the planters will not sell it, at least no more than what they were already obliged to sell. And where that is the case, they have no money to lay out on goods," right? This is the exact thing we're talking about here. The heart-wrenching part about it is what comes next, where he says they had no money to lay out on goods, and they declare that they will let their Negroes go without clothes rather than sell their tobacco at the above price, meaning at the lower price. So this only goes to show that even if these enslaved workers couldn't be laid off, so to speak, I'm sure most of them would have, if not all of them, would very much have wanted that. This deflation cycle impacted their standard of living quite similar to the way it would have impacted other workers in the economy. So one of the questions you may be thinking as you're sitting and hearing about this whole thing is, well, why didn't markets kind of recover? You know, you hear in Econ 101 that markets kind of come to an equilibrium. Why didn't we see this if this went on for year after year after year after year? Well, there's two main answers for that, right? The first is that there was, as we've heard over and over again, there was no money. The actual medium of exchange was non-existent, even if people wanted to buy and sell things. And people realized, despite what some people today, I've recently heard are saying, that the barter system is increasingly inefficient and just not a good way to do things. And so as a result, you can't have market prices kind of equalize in that way. And then another issue, which I believe is much more important, and it's something that my upcoming book is kind of focusing on most, is there was a lack of market integration in the country at large. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, let's say that there is, you know, a glut of N95 masks in New York, and there's a scarcity of them in Boston. Most likely, according to traditional theory, if there's a lot of them in New York, the price will go down. If there's less of them in Boston, the price will go up. And what somebody will do, well, they will go buy the cheap masks in New York and take them to Boston, sell them where the price is higher, and the market will over time kind of equalize both in terms of the stock and the price. The problem with this is you have to assume that the markets are connected, that you can take these masks from New York and sell them in Boston. The problem in this case was the American economy was set up much like a colonial resource-rich economy, whereby the entire economic system was structured not amongst the colonies trading and doing business with each other, but rather each kind of individual pocket pulling things out of the ground and sending them off to the imperial metropole. So, as crazy as it sounds to us today, it was actually not easy in any way, shape, or form to actually trade between New York and Boston. And so that's another reason why these market inefficiencies didn't smooth over time. So what's the takeaway? I've given you a lot of kind of bad news for the economy in this particular period, but how does it spill over into broader society? Well, the first is that there were large-scale uprisings and civic unrest. This is where the society itself kind of starts to change and come apart. We all know about Shays' Rebellion in 1785-86, but this is really just the most prominent of what were hundreds and even thousands of instances of armed revolt across the United States. Again, as I've said before, it was ubiquitous in every state and quite literally in every county of the new United States. You had armed men and women causing all kinds of problems, some smaller and some larger, but largely as a result of this broader economic dislocation. And then the second thing that you get is what the founders called division and usurpation. Now that's kind of an old-timey phrase, but what Hamilton kind of meant by this, he kind of outlined in a speech to the New York legislature in 1787, in which he said, if these states are not unified under a common spirit and a useful federal government, they will indeed have wars with each other, and their divisions will subject them to all the mischiefs of foreign influence and intrigue. There were, in fact, wars between the states, some of them small scale and military, but there was an all-out, and I actually have a paper coming on this quite soon, there was an all-out trade war between the states going on during this time period. We're talking tariff barriers being set up between Rhode Island and Massachusetts, between trade barriers and extra taxes on goods from New York and New Jersey, all across the board. And so what this actually did was exacerbate the problems that were already were outlined earlier in this talk, and cause quite an exacerbation of these already dire economic consequences. So that's a lot of bad news. We have the spillover into the broader society, but as I mentioned, we are actors with agency to some degree. And one thing that I think we can take away from this story is what comes next. What you see coming out of this period, while they indeed didn't do everything right, is you do see a certain group of leaders realize that the United States was better than the sum of its parts, right? They decided that, yes, you could in fact have the states competing against each other for resources and for tax revenue and for benefits from foreign powers, or we can have a sense of political and societal unity, which was manifested in the Constitution, that would allow the United States to at least have some kind of fighting chance in the world. And like I mentioned, they didn't get everything right, but this they certainly did. This kind of political unity or reform paved the way for large-scale economic transformation and reform. And this is something I could talk about for hours. I won't for all of your sake. But as a result of this political and kind of societal consolidation, you started to see both in the states and local areas and in the federal government, a set of policies that really started fixing the ingrained structural problems in the American economy. Right? You had a vast swath of legislation, much more impactful than, in my opinion at least, than even the New Deal, that reformed the American credit and monetary systems, kind of helped alleviate these deflation and monetary scarcity issues. You had the creation of financial and commercial institutions to facilitate transactions and trade. And actually quite quickly, and it's really remarkable, you had the stitching together of the American market to the point where before the revolution, 98% of all American goods and services went across the ocean. That's staggering, but think about that for a second. Whereas by the year 1800, that had fallen to just about 55 to 60%. It's a remarkable transformation and one that was made possible by this broader integration. So what do we learn from this? What can you take out of this and kind of apply to what we're going through at the moment? Well, the first is, and kind of the most important is, that economic crises change societies. They fundamentally do. The United States in 1783 largely resembled that hodgepodge group of colonies that existed for hundreds of years before, both in political and social terms, but absolutely in economic terms. By 1793, just a decade later, you start to see something that looks profoundly different, right? Crises put societies at crossroads, and you don't have a choice not to go, left, right, or straight. And like the founders, I believe that we are indeed at a similar place. I believe that we, in all probability, hasten toward a dangerous crisis from which it may be much difficult to emerge. Our society will change as a result of this, I have no doubt. But what gives me hope, however, is that we have been here before, right? Our forefathers and foremothers have seen this and experienced this before, and change will come. But while no outcome is assured, we do have a fighting chance if we take the lessons of the past and apply them to our current circumstances. This does not mean take direct lines as, oh, Alexander Hamilton did this, we need to do this. But what we can do is distill down the general principles and ideas that they have, that they applied at the end of the Depression of the 1780s, and hopefully bring them into our current dialogue as citizens as well. So I will end it there. I'm going to answer your questions now. I guess we have a few minutes, and Will's going to facilitate that. But I do want to say I'm going to leave my email address up here for just a second. If you do have any questions, I would love to talk to you. I love talking with people who have kind of been part of these. So take down the email. Definitely ask your questions now. But if you would like to email me at this address, you're absolutely, I would be happy to correspond with you. Will.
That was very generous of you, Scott. And thank you for a wonderful talk. I know I learned a lot. While I'm allowing folks to start composing some questions, we already have a couple of early birds here. I want to sort of start with something that was sparked by a slide that you had up earlier in your presentation about why didn't markets recover when you're talking about sort of the 1780s period. And I want to get at the question that you were starting to sort of tease at towards the end of this, which is why did they recover? Like what specifically helped get the colonies out of this mess?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, first off, it was a combination of things we could control and things we couldn't control. So what you tended to see is after the British monetary system kind of got its legs back under it, they lowered interest rates again. That made returns less viable in Britain, and you started to see money actually flow back in and credit flow back into the United States around 1790 or 1792, somewhere in there. But the reforms I specifically talk about, if you want a great read, you should pick up and read Alexander Hamilton's report on public credit, in which he essentially reforms or proposes a program to reform the entire American economic apparatus. It's actually quite striking. In addition to the report on public credit, there was a plan for a national bank and a plan for creating a system of useful manufacturers. But essentially what this did is the bank and then the consolidation and expansion of other banks really helped ease the monetary situation in the United States. So we got rid of the deflationary aspects that I was talking about. There was the consolidation and financing of the American national debt, which was actually quite brilliant and complex, but it helped get Americans' interest rates down, which allowed for more investment. And it also, another thing that was actually quite important is what I said in terms of the market integration question. This isn't necessarily the most popular view, but I believe it's right. But when you have the famous line in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations says, you know, the division of labor is determined by the extent of the market. If your market is really, really small, you really can't do a lot of things you're good at for very long because you can only sell to a few people. But all of a sudden, if you start expanding out your market, you can start to do the things you're better at more often. And you see Americans connecting small markets to each other by way of anything as small as like a path through a field to a little canal around a falls, to connecting these little rural areas to the larger cities by way of, you see a spike in turnpikes and canals. And then what you actually see is a vast expansion of the American coastal trade. So whereas before almost all shipping went across the ocean, within 10 years that essentially swapped so that the majority of American shipping is going from Providence to Philadelphia, not Providence to Glasgow. And so those are just a few of the issues that really helped reform the system.
Thank you for sharing that Hamilton credit piece. I just put that out on chat so folks might have an opportunity to take a look at it. And we have a Hamilton question from John Meigs. He writes, we read that Alexander Hamilton was behind creating a national bank when he pushed that concept. Would he have been familiar with the notion of quantitative easing, buying debt and other securities to create liquidity and put money into consumers' hands?
Oh, yes.
Good question, huh?
Yes and yes. So a lot of people do not know this, but if any historical subject is my baby, it is the Panic of 1791 and 92, in which Alexander Hamilton directed the first bailout in American history. We had our first crisis in 1791, and what Hamilton essentially did was go into the markets and start buying up lots of American government debt as a way of injecting currency into the marketplace, thus alleviating liquidity crunches and credit crunches. So this, in a technical term, is not the same as quantitative easing in a technical sense, but my guess is the broader point is, did Hamilton support measures to actually go out and intervene in the marketplace, buying up assets and thus injecting liquidity into that market? And the answer is undoubtedly and unquestionably yes. I have a paper on this crisis where I detail the bailouts in detail. There were actually 2 or 3 independent rounds of them, in which, and this blew my mind, depending on how you inflate the numbers, but if you take the sums that were made in the day and inflate them up into current values, Hamilton spent the current value of anywhere between 80 and $100 billion, which compared to 2 trillion in recent days, that doesn't seem like a lot, but any time before right now, that's a massive number. And he did this in 1791 and 92.
I'd like to bring in Jan Van Eck, who has sort of a question of a similar vein. Today we have welfare programs. Who did struggling Americans rely upon them? Family, church, other institutions?
Yeah, Jan, this depended on the place. It was largely place contingent. So if you think about Philadelphia, they actually had a relatively robust social welfare system. It was not necessarily generous in terms of the terms. You had to go to a workhouse and do, in many cases, hard labor. But they did have systems by which, free medicine would be given to people who were out of jobs, where free food would be given to people out of jobs. And in some places, and this is quite interesting, there were actually cash payments to people that were out of jobs. That should sound familiar. That said, that was not universal. There were certainly places where if you didn't fall back on the generosity of family or the church in most cases, you were out of luck. But and a lot of people were out of luck in that respect. So I would say it was highly dependent on where you lived.
Yeah, so not necessarily something that we want to replicate in this current crisis.
I would not know.
So that takes us to our next question from Jan Miller. What are these principles from this crisis that you believe could or should be applied today?
That's an excellent question. I think probably the first, and this is something that some people like politicize, but I think from a strictly business perspective, the one that we need to reform is how we do health insurance. I'm not a Medicare for all person. But I do believe we need a sense of universal coverage in some way that's transferable, and not for any ideological reason, but for the fact that entrepreneurs, if they're going to start a business, need to have some sense that if they go out and take a risk on starting a business, they don't have to worry about their child getting sick and them have to die. So a lot of times this debate is largely framed in ideological terms. But if you look at countries that do have a system that is not what we would call state-run, like Britain and Canada have a state-run system, but if you look at a place like the Netherlands or even Switzerland, which I'm a big fan of, these are completely private systems, but they are universal, and these countries have much, much higher rates of business openings, entrepreneurial activity, and social mobility in this particular sense. So my argument for this is not necessarily from a moral case, although I think we can definitely demand that, but it's good for business, and that's been proven all over the world.
Yeah, so it sounds like when you're talking about universal healthcare, you're talking about a healthcare that is detached from your individual employment. So
yeah,
if you use your job, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And going back to the fireside chat kind of nature of this talk, it's really interesting because a lot of people don't know that employer-based health insurance was a historical accident. It was an artifact of World War II and the fact that there were caps on salary given. And so employers started to say, hey, we can't pay you more, but we'll pay for your doctor's visits. There was nothing kind of structured or planned about this at all. It just kind of got locked in as a result of World War II and carried forward without any real kind of consideration about, okay, this was necessary at the time, but is this the right way to do that? And from an entrepreneurial perspective, I would say no.
Well, thank you for unpacking that. John Meigs has another question for us. How important was English capital in financing development in the US after the revolution? And was French capital also involved?
No, that's a good question. Yes, English capital was important. Americans really wanted French capital, but the French never really seemed to get around to it. You see these complaints all the time with American businessmen saying, you know, they said they would have our back after the war, and now I'm trying to get them to invest in my business, and they don't seem to really care what's going on. So yeah, the American economy was heavily reliant on English capital for development after the revolution, but also on institutions that were made and built to mobilize that capital and capitalize on it, if you will, once it got on these shores again.
Excellent.
And that actually did not change until the late 19th century. America was relying on external capital all the way up until the verge of the 20th century.
So we're just about out of time, but I want to give the last question to Stephanie Loudon, who asks, there was, as you hinted, massive public backlash to many of the policies needed for economic revival in the 1780s. What might be some takeaways from handling that backlash that we should be thinking about today?
Oh, man. I think this is a really hard one, needle to thread. I do think that a lot of times financial desperation causes people to do crazy things. And so I do think a certain part of that is to help relieve that financial and economic strain as best as we can without necessarily going overboard. That said, I feel that in kind of a country that cherishes the kind of history that we do have, and I am a huge fan of it, we take our myth very, very seriously. And so this myth of, you know, Shays Rebellion, that kind of the guy standing up and resisting tyranny, while that is legitimate in some ways, is held on to in circumstances that I don't think is necessarily tyrannical today. And so this is a hard one. I don't know if I can answer that particular question, but starting with alleviating the financial constraints on some people as best as we can within reason, I think would be a good place to start.
Very helpful. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing this fascinating and topical research at this moment. It's been a pleasure having you on. And as we look ahead to next week, same time, same place, your living room, we'll be hearing from Allison Lange, who's going to be discussing her new book, Picturing Political Power Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement, published just last month by the University of Chicago. So with that, thank you all for joining us. And we have generously received your email address, so I would expect a good deal of outreach from our listeners.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Take care, all.